As you heard, I'm with Code for Africa. I'm actually based out of Tbilisi, or speaking to you from Tbilisi at the moment, which is where I'm based. And I'm the CEO at Code for Africa, but we've gone into a partnership or a joint venture with ICFJ, which many of you folk probably know about. They've got 40 years of an impact kind of rich history in the US. And we've created a new joint venture called ICFJ Plus, which includes a third partner based out of India called Proto. All three of us have different strengths. ICFJ obviously have these global networks and deep domain expertise around journalism and media creation itself. Code for Africa is a little bit of a hybrid. We bring a lot more of the technical data and AI kind of skill sets, but also with deep roots in media. We've been around for 12 years now. And then Proto is very much around service design, also rooted in media. And so it's a very technical implementation focused partnership. We've over the years worked extensively with news creators in various formats. The image on the screen at the moment is from Perugia in the Journalism Festival in Perugia a little bit earlier this year. My co-CEO at ICFJ Plus, Sharon Moshavi, is actually in the audience with you at the moment. She's the third person from the, I think it's your right, or possibly left, not holding a trophy in that picture. So grab her after the talk as well. These news creators, many of them are quite sophisticated. They are micromedia is a term that we prefer using rather than newsfluencer internally. They are often 2 or 3 person production teams producing very slick content. I'll show you an example in a moment. And the reason why they're getting traction is because globally, social media use is overtaking TV for the first time ever as a news source. We work extensively with the Reuters Institute in Oxford University, and they're about to launch their digital news report for 2025, which confirms the shift across 48 markets globally, so 48 countries globally. The research finds that almost half of people who are 18 to 24 say that social media is their primary main source of news. And in some of the more youthful countries like Kenya, where we work, but also in places like India and Philippines, most of the youth in those countries say that they prefer to watch news rather than read it. And as a result of that, we're seeing even podcasts now starting to film and distribute their podcasts on video channels like YouTube and TikTok. So what does that look like? Here's an example of the winners of an ICFJ a News Creator Award that was announced in Perugia in partnership with YouTube. And it'll give you a little bit of a flavor for what the actual content looks like.
How bad is this going to get?
How did they figure that out?
Where did those numbers come from?
How are they measuring this?
How does this work? How does that work?
How do they know?
How do you detect pain in animals that don't make faces?
How do we know what colors humans can or can't see?
How good you feel in your life?
Is this amount of alcohol dangerous?
How many calories are in there?
So what do they do? How do they figure it out?
Those kinds of questions are what our little YouTube channel here is designed to answer.
And so Hartown was the US winner in that recent competition. As you can see, really slickly produced. Let me try and get to the next slide. My apologies. Really slickly produced, and I would say in many ways very comparable with mainstream media operations. But those aren't the folk that we really should be focusing on. They've already got large audiences. They understand the craft of storytelling, and often they've migrated out of legacy media and they're busy creating something new. So they understand journalism and media to a large extent. What we've been doing at Code for Africa, which is slightly different, is trying to focus on the new generation of influencers or peace builders or connectors in their own societies at a micro or a nano level. These are people who have followings, less than 50,000 people following them online. And the map that you can see on the screen is the places where Code for Africa works in Africa. Most of those, or at least half of those countries, are either currently conflict zones, meaning war zones, or they're ruled by military junta, or they have other oppressive kinds of kind of authoritarian governments. And so often these connectors and peace builders at community level become the trusted source of information, not necessarily news, but this is where people know someone face to face, or there's a personal connection of some sort, and they trust them as someone who can go and find useful, actionable information. So how have we been finding them? Code for Africa traditionally has been an investigative forensic technology organization. We support frontline fact checkers, investigative journalists, war reporters or conflict reporters, but also increasingly people who look into disinformation. And we've been doing that now for about 6 or 7 years for major partners, including the UN and others. What we realized there was that using those techniques, we found that we're starting to discover not just bad or malign or toxic actors, but we were finding the connective tissue, the glue that often held together societies that were fragmented and polarized and radicalized. And we started realizing that we could map both the bad guys and the good guys. And we did that using some fairly weirdly named kind of tools, something called a kill chain, developed and coming from a security background, the original methodology, but it's been adopted for understanding information warfare. So reverse engineering this, we realized that we could start identifying these people who seem to be playing a positive role in terms of firstly, vetting and validating trustworthy information, but secondly, also tamping down and helping people understand polarization or extremism efforts for what they were, that they were wedge issues or wedge campaigns designed to disrupt and fragment our societies. And then when we started identifying them, we realized we actually don't understand these people. They operate and they function in a way that is very different from traditional media. And that's because their audiences, who are primarily youthful and act as intermediaries with older audiences that tend to be offline, they gather and they consume the information in radically different ways. And so we partnered, or we were part of a study run by FT Strategies out of London. It looked at 3 countries, including the US, India, and then Nigeria and South Africa, in Africa, as indicative of the continent. And it found, by doing one-on-one extensive interviews and data analysis, that there are 4 defining characteristics or behaviors of how audiences are consuming content that is not traditional media. And if we want to try and reform and help media, we need to understand these behaviors. So firstly, there is a big emphasis on simultasking, so doing more than one thing at a time. And using more than one source and one tool to arrive at an information kind of destination. Secondly, they find information through trusted source networks. And this is where those nano influencers become very, very important. And then once they've found trusted information, they don't just want information, they want to make or use it to make sense of their world and of the conversations that they're seeing around them. And so there are a whole lot of activities around sense making. And then finally, these are not naive kind of content or information users. They're incredibly sophisticated around using search, not using Google, but using things like TikTok and other sources of news to search for solutions. So what do we do with that? We then developed a model that we used that we could try and understand how to engage with them in a structured way. And the 2 pieces of this model that I think are particularly important for media planners and media support agencies are to understand that trusted sources do not self-identify always as journalists. In fact, as Sharon will tell you as an anecdote, in Perugia, when she was speaking to some of the winners, she found that most of these content creators do not self-identify as journalists. In fact, they say doing that would rob them of authenticity and of credibility with their audiences. So we should not try and turn these creators into journalists. We rather need to figure out how to work alongside them. And that's because they also do things that traditionally media or journalists have been shy to do, especially in North America. For example, turning information into real action, where we try and draw a line and we say, we give you the information, we're impartial, what you do with it is up to you. These new creators and influencers or newsfluencers are not scared about actually taking that next step. And so it's a synergistic relationship rather than a co-option that we should be thinking about. We also find that the modes of consumption of how both the audiences, but also these influencers actually find and consume information has changed dramatically. And so there's this this kind of three phases, but also four modes of kind of consumption. Firstly, the inputs are very different from our traditional media, and this is echoed in the DNR report that Reuters is bringing out later this week. But firstly, it's social media, which we all know about. The big one, which is almost like a dark horse, is that group chat is increasingly formative in terms of telling people what they should be worrying about and what is current and they should be caring about, and then where to find information. Notifications have a utility, but more annoyance than anything else. And then word of mouth is incredibly important. Once the information or the user becomes aware that there is information, they then start sifting through all this noise, this fire hose of information that lands on their devices. And they do that by doing a couple of things. They have these modes of consumption that is very different. So firstly, they substantiate and they try and ask, how do I know if something is true? And the way they do this is firstly through some brand affiliation. So there is skepticism, widespread skepticism about online info that they find. They might look for a media brand to substantiate the information if it's straight news. But more importantly, they verify by going to who do I know personally and trust. And who I trust, meaning I know their motives, I know who they are, and I know how to get to them if I need to hold them accountable. And so substantiation is a really important filter. Next, they move into this kind of study mode where they actually will do a deep dive if it's an issue that they care about enough, and they'll research the topic on TikTok, if they're older like me, YouTube, or on the other platforms where they can find easy to find information. AI is increasingly becoming an easy kind of lazy tool to use to do this kind of study mode. And then they socialize. Once they think they've got a handle on the issue and the topic, they don't just take that as assumed and then kind of shape their world and the actions around it. They go back to the people that they know in their circle and they bounce this idea off them to see if, have I understood it correctly? Have my sources been great, or do I need to find someone else? And then finally, they move into this active mode where they say, now, what can I do with this information? And how can I change the world or make an action in my own life that means that I can operationalize this information? This is very different from how traditional media operates, but there are massive synergies here. If we move out of the mindset of having to co-opt either the creators who drive this new information economy, or try and kind of in ways that are going to feel foreign and kind of offensive, try and impose ourselves into this new existing behavior matrix. The detailed report with all of those findings can be found on the link. I'll share the slides afterwards so that you can dig down into how this might fit into your own ecosystem kind of information research, or alternatively to shape some of your programming. As I said, it's across multiple countries, but more importantly, that research needs to be read in conjunction with something like the Reuters research or the equivalent in the countries where you operate in. So Pew would be a good one, who you heard on the previous speaker mention. This, the Reuters report, which is across 48 separate countries, including Africa, Asia, and North America, is going to be launched officially on the 17th. And then if you want to speak about how to use some of the practical digital tools that we've developed, they're all open source. We're more than happy to share. As I said, my co-CEO, Sharon, is in the audience, very happy to both share and test these tools. There will obviously be tweaks in local kind of geographies because the context does change, and so does the age demographic, which does impact on how people consume information. So I think I'm at time, but very keen to assist with any questions afterwards. And again, the tools that we're using are a combination of old school kind of digital tools, smart tools, they're kind of natural language processing tools, but also increasingly AI, Gen AI driven ways of interpreting and speeding up the identification of these micro and nano influencers, and then understanding how we might add value to their existing kind of micro communities. Thanks very much. Back to you, Rosny.